Hey guys, tonight we won't just tell a history story. We are going to step into the terrifying nightmare of a young girl who suffered from obsession, shame, and painful betrayal. Imagine this. An adolescent princess, Elizabeth I, having long lost her mother, sought comfort and a home with her stepfather's family. But instead of protection, she found a monster lurking beneath aristocratic robes that was Thomas Seymour, 1st Baron Seymour, husband of the Dowager, Queen Catherine Parr. Thomas Seymour was not just a power-hungry schemer, jealous of his own brother, but also a sinister shadow who abused and harassed Elizabeth I in the most contemptible way. Just think, what pain must have gnawed at Elizabeth's soul, having to endure humiliation, being dragged into a scandal that could have ruined both her honor and her life, while she was merely an orphan girl under the harsh reign of King Edward VI. This is the deepest scar in the life of the great queen. She would later become a tragedy that forced her to grow up in fear, to learn how to be hardened to the point of cruelty just to protect herself. In the end, Thomas Seymour was executed for treason. But was the crime he committed against Elizabeth ever truly avenged? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I would love for you to share in the comments section. Where are you watching from? And what time is it locally right now? Thank you for your valuable time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Thomas Seymour drifted into Tudor history as one of its most troubling and sinister figures, a man whose presence seemed to darken every place his footsteps touched. In an age already crowded with scandal, executions, and the grim theatre of ambition, his shadow still managed to stand apart, darker, sharper, and far more unsettling. He was the brother of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII. Yet unlike Jane, who was remembered with gentleness, Thomas carried within him a restlessness made of jealousy, wounded pride, and a hunger for power that never slept. That hunger guided him, shaped him, and finally destroyed him. Thomas and his elder brother, Edward Seymour, became uncles to the long-awaited heir when Jane Seymour gave birth to Prince Edward. This new connection to the future of England placed both brothers in a privileged position. Though Jane died from childbirth complications, Thomas remained securely woven into the life of King Henry VIII. The king, seeing a kind of usefulness in him, entrusted Thomas with delicate diplomatic missions, sending him to foreign courts to represent England's interests. It was a sign of trust, a sign that Thomas, had he chosen a steadier path, might have built a respectable legacy. He travelled first to the French court to meet Anne of Cleves, the woman who would briefly become Henry's fourth wife. Afterward, he journeyed to the Hungarian court in hopes of gathering support for England against France and Scotland. These missions, though politically intricate and sometimes perilous, showed clearly that Henry considered Thomas capable, reliable enough to carry the crown's intentions across borders. But war shifted everything. In the year 1543, when conflict between England and France broke open again, Thomas was elevated to the role of Marshal of the English army in the Netherlands. He commanded forces, seized strongholds, destroyed enemy fortifications, and proved that, at least militarily, he possessed skill and boldness. For his service, he was appointed Master General of the Ordnance, and later Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, positions of genuine authority that placed England's defences partly in his hands. For a moment it seemed as though ambition had rewarded him. Yet that moment ended when King Henry VIII died in January of the year 1547. His death loosened the ground beneath every powerful man in England, and for Thomas, it awakened a storm that had been waiting inside him for years. With the accession of 9-year-old Edward, now King Edward VI, the kingdom became vulnerable, quiet, uncertain, soft at the edges. Thomas saw in that softness an opportunity. The young king was orphaned, alone and formally incapable of ruling. Surely Thomas believed he was the one meant to guide him. Surely he, not his brother, was the rightful hand that should shape the kingdom. But the Regency Council thought otherwise. They chose Edward Seymour, Thomas's elder brother, to serve as Lord Protector. And in that moment, jealousy began to seep through Thomas like cold water through cloth. He watched power gather in Somerset's hands, watched the court defer to him, watched the kingdom shift around his authority. And the more he watched, the more something darkened inside him. What had once been ambition became a slow-burning resentment. What had once been confidence twisted into envy. Every honour Somerset received felt like an insult. Every command he issued felt like a door locked in Thomas's face. Bit by bit, Thomas allowed these thoughts to take root, whispering to him that he deserved more, that he was being overshadowed unfairly, that the throne of influence could be his if he only reached far enough. As the reign of young Edward began, Thomas's steps grew heavier, his thoughts sharper, his desires more desperate. He began to drift toward choices that shimmered like possibilities in the distance, choices that would soon entangle him in betrayal, deceit, and treason. And though he did not yet see it, the path he walked from this moment forward curved gently, silently, toward a fate already waiting for him at its end. After the death of King Henry VIII, Thomas Seymour moved quietly, almost instinctively, toward the opening he had been waiting for. Catherine Parr, the king's widow, the woman who had once shared a tender, unfinished affection with him, became the centre of his thoughts, the first step in a new climb toward power. He had known Catherine long before she became Henry's sixth wife. There had been warmth between them, something unspoken but unmistakable, and now, with the king gone, Thomas allowed that old flame to guide his ambition. He did not wait long. The king died in the cold month of January in the year 1547, and before winter had even loosened its hold, Thomas began his pursuit. His attentions were swift, deliberate, and wrapped in the softness of love, though behind that softness pulsed his steady hunger for influence. Only 4 months after Henry's death, around the quiet days of May in the same year, Thomas and Catherine married in secret. No trumpets, no courtly witnesses, no royal approval, only a hidden ceremony, done quickly, whispered away from the ears of those who would have stopped it. When the truth emerged, it struck the court like a sudden storm. The Regency Council had not been informed. The kingdom's people, still mourning their king, felt betrayed. Many whispered angrily that Henry's body was not yet cold. Yet the Queen Dowager had already taken another husband, and not just any husband, but Thomas Seymour, a man already known for ambition that glowed too brightly. Young King Edward VI, barely 9 years old, heard the news with dismay, and his elder sister Mary reacted with sharp, open outrage. She even urged Princess Elizabeth to keep her distance from Catherine, insisting the marriage was shameful. The council summoned Thomas and Catherine for reprimand, scolding them with the weight of royal authority. Within the Seymour family, the marriage deepened old rivalries. Catherine, now married into the family again, found herself clashing with Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, the man who held all real power in England. What had once been tension became a cold, rising hostility. The household grew heavy with unspoken competition, and Thomas, restless as always, let the pressure feed his dissatisfaction. Yet the scandal of the marriage was merely the doorway to a darker corridor. For hidden inside Catherine's home was a presence far more delicate, far more vulnerable than anyone understood, the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth. She lived with Catherine as though she were a daughter, sheltered, educated, cared for, a young girl, still forming her view of the world, still learning how to move through its shadows. But in that same house walked Thomas Seymour. And what began as small, seemingly harmless gestures soon shifted into something troubling, something that made the air in the corridors feel heavier. Seymour's footsteps became familiar in the early mornings, long before the sun fully woke. He would step into Elizabeth's chamber uninvited, his voice soft, his manner too familiar. What he called playfulness stretched quickly toward the edge of propriety, and then quietly, unsettlingly beyond it. Those early visits, those touches dressed as jokes, those moments when he lingered too near her bed, they were the beginning of a descent he would never rise from again. Elizabeth, barely more than a child, found herself shrinking away, burying herself under bedclothes, avoiding corners of the house where she feared she might meet him alone. Catherine's home, once a place of refuge, began to feel like something else, a place where danger moved quietly, gently, beneath the surface. This was the point from which Thomas Seymour's legacy would darken forever. The scandal of a hasty marriage was already enough to stain his reputation, but what he did inside Catherine's home under the same roof as a 14-year-old princess would one day define him as one of the most unsettling men of the Tudor age. Each morning he stepped across Elizabeth's threshold, each boundary he crossed, each moment he pushed beyond what was decent, became another thread in the tapestry of his downfall. What followed from here would unravel slowly, painfully, dragging him into the deepest shadows of his own making. Thomas Seymour's behaviour inside Chelsea Manor, during the months he lived under the same roof as Catherine Parr and the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth, formed the darkest and most disturbing chapter of his life. What happened there unfolded slowly, quietly, in the soft hours of early morning, yet each small act carried a weight that history would never forget. Many witnesses later gave their accounts, but none more clearly than Cat Ashley, Elizabeth's devoted governess, who watched with rising dread as Thomas crossed line after line. Thomas often entered Elizabeth's chamber at dawn, long before the household had properly awakened. He wore only his nightgown, slippers on his bare feet, moving through the corridors with a casual confidence that made his visits feel almost routine. If Elizabeth was already standing, he would greet her lightly, sometimes tapping her back, sometimes striking her lower body in a way he disguised as a playful gesture. If she was still in bed, half hidden beneath blankets, he would move closer, prompting her to retreat deeper into the sheets to shield herself. On one of those mornings, Cat Ashley caught sight of Thomas bending toward Elizabeth as though to kiss her while she lay in bed. Cat, protective and horrified, scolded him without hesitation, but her words slipped off him like water from a stone. He did not retreat. He did not reconsider. Instead, his visits grew more frequent, and each visit pushed further than the one before. He began to wander the house in his nightclothes, laughing with the young women of the household, teasing them, then circling back toward Elizabeth's door, as though it were a place he felt entitled to return to. And through all of this, the person who should have been Elizabeth's greatest shield, Catherine Parr, failed her in ways history still struggles to understand. More than once, Catherine not only allowed Thomas's behaviour but participated in it. There was a morning when Catherine held Elizabeth still, her hands firm, while Thomas wrapped his arms around the girl. There was another morning when both husband and wife stepped into Elizabeth's room together, pulling back her covers, tickling her, coaxing reactions from a child who could not escape them. What they treated as harmless amusement was, to Elizabeth, a humiliating violation of her safety. The most shocking moment came in the garden, on a day that would echo through centuries of historical retellings. Thomas appeared with a pair of scissors. Catherine held Elizabeth in place, preventing her from slipping away. And while the spring air drifted softly across the garden, Thomas cut Elizabeth's outer gown into pieces, slashing fabric, exposing her, making a spectacle of her embarrassment. The gesture was presented as mischief, but its cruelty was unmistakable. It struck at Elizabeth's dignity in a way that left her shaken and ashamed. Some accounts, still debated, still painful to read, suggest that Thomas may have attempted to go even further, though the historical record leaves those details in a haze of rumour and accusation. Yet even without those claims, the pattern of behaviour at Chelsea was disturbing enough to stain Thomas Seymour's name forever. For a time, Catherine insisted that these games were nothing more than harmless fun. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she wished to maintain peace within her home, even at the cost of her own judgment. But when she became pregnant in the spring of the year 1548, her clarity sharpened. She noticed how often Thomas and Elizabeth found themselves alone. She noticed glances, silences, and the way Elizabeth seemed both frightened and uncertain, pulled into a world she did not understand. Jealousy flickered first, then fear, then shame. Catherine finally grasped the truth she had avoided. Thomas's attention toward Elizabeth had gone far beyond anything acceptable, and her own participation, even if rooted in denial, had allowed it to continue. And so, with a heavy heart and a troubled conscience, she made the only choice she could. She sent Elizabeth away from Chelsea Manor, away from Thomas, away from the tension that had poisoned the house. The departure ended the daily horrors Elizabeth had endured, but its shadow remained a shadow that would follow both Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour into the next chapters of their lives, shaping futures neither of them could yet imagine. When Catherine Parr finally understood the true weight of Thomas Seymour's behaviour toward the 14-year-old princess in her care, she knew she could no longer pretend it was harmless. The realization rose slowly inside her first, as a flicker of jealousy, then as unease, then as a cold, immovable truth. Whatever his intentions, Thomas had crossed too many boundaries, and Elizabeth, young and unprotected, had been placed in a danger she could not name. And so Catherine made her decision. She sent Elizabeth away from Chelsea Manor, away from the corridors where Thomas's footsteps had become a quiet threat. Though the choice was guided partly by jealousy and partly by fear, it ended up shielding Elizabeth from something far more destructive. After leaving Chelsea Manor, Elizabeth wrote to Catherine a letter soft in tone, carefully measured, yet full of sadness between its lines. She thanked her stepmother with graceful restraint, but her words revealed the ache beneath her calm exterior. She confessed that she was sorrowful to depart, that the warning Catherine had given her about possible dangers weighed deeply on her mind. She did not protest. She did not blame. But she showed, with gentle honesty, that she understood Catherine's mistrust, even if it wounded her. Her phrasing, quiet, composed, thoughtful, already reflected the woman she would one day become. Steady in crisis, precise in speech, cautious in every gesture. Even at 14, she wielded restraint like a shield, shaping her emotions into something controlled, something dignified. These traits, born from hardship, would later define the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Yet beneath that composure, a deeper scar had begun to take shape. To be violated emotionally and physically while still a young girl, and by the husband of the woman who acted as her mother, was a wound that would never fully heal. It carved itself into the core of her being, settling in the place where trust should have been. Many historians believe that this experience, this early collision with danger disguised as affection, was one of the reasons Elizabeth chose never to marry. Her decision to call herself the Virgin Queen may have been political, but its roots likely dug far deeper, into memories she rarely spoke of and never confronted directly. While Elizabeth tried to recover from the confusion and shame of those months, Thomas Seymour drifted further into shadows of his own making. Catherine Parr died in the year 1548, after giving birth to her daughter. Her death removed the final barrier between Thomas and the reckless ambition he had nursed for years. Almost immediately, he turned his gaze back toward Elizabeth, no longer as a girl he teased or tormented, but as a gateway to power. If he could marry her, he would place himself dangerously close to the throne. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII, the sister of the young king, and a potential heir to the realm. Through her, Thomas saw a shortcut, a path that could lift him above his brother, above the council, above every man who had ever stood in his way. It was a plan so bold it teetered on madness, and yet he followed it without hesitation. Rumours began to swell across England. They whispered that Elizabeth was pregnant with Thomas's child. They claimed she had been taken to the Tower of London. They spread wild, poisonous stories designed to stain her name. Elizabeth was forced to defend herself, writing firmly that she was not with child and not within the tower. She had to deny every accusation, every slander, with the full weight of her young dignity. She kept her distance from Thomas, knowing that even a single misstep could destroy her future. Yet even this turmoil was only the beginning. For while Thomas pursued Elizabeth, he also stepped deeper into a far more treacherous battlefield, one where ambition could no longer hide behind charm or flirtation. His attention shifted toward the heart of England's fragile power, the boy King Edward VI. It was there, in his attempts to influence, manipulate, and ultimately control the young monarch, that Thomas Seymour crossed a line from dangerous to catastrophic. He had already harmed a young princess. Now he was marching toward the throne itself and toward the doom that awaited him there. Thomas's desire for power began to swell beyond anything that morality or law could contain. What had started as envy toward his elder brother, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector Somerset, slowly changed into a consuming ambition. He no longer wished to stand beside Somerset. He wanted to rise above him, to seize the role of regent for himself, to shape England through the hands of the young king, Edward VI. And to do that, he knew he needed influence over the boy. Quietly, steadily, Thomas began visiting the king's bedchamber. Edward was still a child, only 9 years old, innocent in ways that made him easy to sway. Thomas brought him gifts, coins, trinkets, small tokens meant to win affection. He whispered flattery, warm words, gentle encouragement, and behind the scenes he paid others at court to speak ill of Somerset, planting seeds of doubt in the boy's mind. But Somerset was no fool. He noticed the unusual closeness, the late-night visits, the murmurs behind closed doors. Suspicion settled like a chill over the court. Somerset ordered that Thomas be watched carefully, that no door be left unguarded, no corridor left unobserved. One night, Thomas pushed too far. He attempted to break into the king's chamber, but the door had been bolted from within. As he tugged at it, a spaniel belonging to Edward VI awoke and began barking. The sharp sound cut through the quiet of the palace. Startled and enraged, Thomas drew a weapon and shot the dog, its body falling silent on the cold floor. Then he fled into the shadows. The incident darkened every thought surrounding him. Many believed, with growing horror, that he had intended to kidnap or even assassinate the young king. And the very next morning, when Thomas was seen near Edward's chamber carrying a loaded pistol, fear hardened into certainty. The court could ignore him no longer. He was seized, disarmed, and taken to the Tower of London. Along with him, Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry, servants of Princess Elizabeth, were arrested on suspicion of having knowledge of his plan to marry the princess. Whispers spread rapidly that Seymour had been plotting to wed Elizabeth since Catherine Parr's death. Elizabeth, horrified at being dragged once again into his schemes, wrote firmly that such accusations were shameful slanders. She denied all rumours of pregnancy, of secret meetings, of conspiracies, knowing that her future depended entirely on her reputation remaining untouched. Inside the tower, Thomas faced the enormity of his actions. The list of charges against him grew into 33 counts of treason, a staggering number, each one heavier than the last. That he had attempted to kidnap King Edward VI, that he had intended to murder him, that he had plotted to overthrow the Lord Protector, that he had conspired with pirates to ignite rebellion, that he had sought to marry Princess Elizabeth to claim the throne, that he had married Catherine Parr with indecent haste for political gain. These accusations formed a net from which he could not escape. Yet the cruelest part of his fate was not the charges themselves, but the signature that sealed it. His own brother, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, was the one who signed the warrant for his execution. It was a moment that carved a wound into the Seymour family that would never fully heal. On the 20th day of March in the year 1549, Thomas Seymour was led to Tower Hill. A crowd gathered, thick and silent, to watch the fall of the man whose ambition had scorched everything it touched. The axe rose, the axe fell, and with that single swing, his life ended. But his shadow remained. Thomas Seymour became a symbol of greed without restraint, of betrayal without remorse, of the darkest impulses that ran beneath the glitter of Tudor England. Even in death, he stood as a warning, a reminder that ambition untethered can destroy not only the man who holds it, but everyone who strays too close to its fire. Throughout the months spent at Chelsea Manor, the connection between Thomas Seymour and the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth became a dark knot of rumours, suspicions, and uneasy silences. The pattern of inappropriate behaviour alone was enough to stain Thomas forever, yet the original account suggests something even heavier, an unspoken possibility that he may have attempted to cross boundaries far beyond what was ever openly acknowledged. No contemporary source dared to declare it outright, but the descriptions left behind Elizabeth shrinking away beneath her bedclothes, the struggle between them, the teasing that slipped towards something more intimate, and the constant intervention of Cat Ashley have led many historians to wonder whether Thomas sought to use the young princess not only as an object of desire, but as a stepping stone toward greater power. Moments such as Catherine Parr holding Elizabeth in place so Thomas could embrace her, or the disturbing scene in which he cut Elizabeth's gown into pieces before others, created a thick atmosphere of shame and confusion. These small fragments woven together through witness accounts suggest a troubling closeness, a blurring of lines that Elizabeth, still a child, could not possibly understand or navigate. Even if no physical relationship occurred, the emotional charge, the power imbalance, and the invasive attention all pointed to something deeply inappropriate. At the centre of everything stood one undeniable truth. Elizabeth was still a young, vulnerable girl, only 14. Thomas was 25 years older, a grown man with authority, position, and influence. He was the husband of her guardian, the uncle of the young King Edward VI, and a figure who held far more power than she could ever resist. The imbalance made any gesture from him an act of dominance, not affection and exploitation of the innocents placed under his roof. Some accounts hint that Elizabeth might have formed a naive admiration for Thomas. It is not difficult to understand why. She was a girl who had lost her mother early in life, who lived beside Catherine Parr as if she were a second mother, and who rarely encountered adult men who treated her with warmth or attention. Thomas approached her with a mix of charm and boldness that no one else offered. For a young girl seeking affection, the confusion between admiration and danger became tragically easy to fall into. But Cat Ashley saw the truth more clearly. Each morning she pushed Thomas out of the princess's chamber, shielded her as best she could, and carried the dread that Catherine refused to acknowledge. As rumours of a relationship spread beyond the walls of Chelsea Manor, the court began to watch Elizabeth with suspicion. The threat to her reputation grew quickly. One whisper could undo her future. One accusation could brand her forever. And for a princess who would one day become Queen Elizabeth I, the risk was life-altering. If Thomas Seymour had succeeded in drawing her into his grasp, whether emotionally or politically, her standing as a potential heir might have been destroyed. The danger deepened after Catherine Parr's death in the year 1548. Freed from the constraints of marriage, Thomas shifted immediately, almost coldly, toward a new intention: to marry Elizabeth herself. In his mind, the path was simple. Elizabeth held the blood of kings. She was the daughter of Henry VIII. If he could claim her hand, he could claim a place near the throne or perhaps one day on it. His desire for power wrapped itself in the language of courtship, but beneath it lay treason. For Elizabeth, this was the most perilous moment of her young life. The rumours of affection, the lingering shadows of their time at Chelsea, the whispers of marriage, it all formed a net around her. One misstep, one careless word, could have destroyed her position forever. Yet this was precisely the moment in which her extraordinary intelligence emerged. She spoke cautiously. She wrote carefully. She avoided any gesture that could be misinterpreted. She protected herself with silence, dignity, and restraint. It was in this dark chapter, surrounded by scandal, accusation, and fear, that Elizabeth's future strength began to crystallize. She learned to guard herself, to stand still in a storm, to survive danger not by fighting it, but by outlasting it. And in doing so, she slipped under the shadow of Thomas Seymour's ambition, stepping quietly out of the trap that might have ended her life before her reign even began. When the formal investigation into Thomas Seymour began, Elizabeth's name was pulled instantly and violently into its centre. Dark rumours spread through the court like smoke, slipping under every door. Whispers claimed that she was with child by Thomas Seymour, that she had been taken to the Tower of London, that she had promised herself in marriage to him. Such accusations were not simple gossip. In the Tudor world, they were lethal. A stain on her reputation could unravel her future, destroy her claim, and even place her life in danger. The Tudor court had no patience for uncertainty, especially when it involved succession and treason. Even the hint of conspiracy could send anyone, princess or not, to the block. Faced with these poisonous rumours, Elizabeth had no choice but to act. She wrote a letter to the Regency Council, addressing the accusations directly. In her calm, deliberate handwriting, she declared the stories to be slanders, vile falsehoods, meant to drag her name into the mud. She insisted that she was clean and healthy, not pregnant, not hidden away, not involved in any promise of marriage. She requested the right to appear before the council, to show her face, her composure, her truth. It was a bold decision for a girl of 14 or 15, but it was also brilliant. By confronting the accusations head-on, Elizabeth separated herself from Thomas Seymour completely, drawing a firm boundary between his recklessness and her innocence. Her clarity stunned many who later reflected on this moment. For someone so young, Elizabeth displayed a depth of political instinct that few adults possessed. The months at Chelsea Manor, filled with confusion, fear, and the need to stay constantly alert, had taught her far more than etiquette and languages. They had taught her how to survive in a world where a woman's safety and honor could vanish in an instant. She learned to guard her words, her expressions, her alliances. She learned that silence could be as powerful as speech, and that dignity was a shield stronger than steel. Meanwhile, the investigation widened. Cat Ashley, who had witnessed nearly every troubling moment between Seymour and the princess, was arrested and questioned. Thomas Parry, the head of Elizabeth's household, was taken as well. Their detainment sent a chilling message. No one connected to Seymour was safe. Elizabeth stood alone at the centre of suspicion, watched from all sides, judged by every whisper. The court waited to see whether the girl would collapse or hold firm. But Elizabeth did neither. She stood still, measured, quiet, impossibly composed. She refused to condemn Seymour outright, knowing that her words could be twisted into accusations against her. Yet she refused, too, to defend him. With each letter, each answer, each carefully chosen phrase, she wove herself out of danger thread by thread. She practiced the very style of rule she would later use throughout her 45 years as queen. Never reveal too much, never react too quickly, and never let anyone hold power over her reputation. Through this delicate balance, Elizabeth was eventually declared innocent. Her name, though bruised by rumour, was not broken. Her position remained intact, but the emotional wound, the deep, private scar left by Seymour's behaviour, stayed with her. What she endured in those years shaped her deeply. It taught her not to trust easily. It taught her that affection could be a trap. It taught her that men in power could use the innocence of a girl as a ladder toward their own ambitions. For Elizabeth, the nightmare slowly began to fade. But for Thomas Seymour, it was only the beginning of a descent that would swallow him whole. His jealousy, his recklessness, and his desire to control the young king would soon push him toward decisions far more catastrophic than anything he had done at Chelsea Manor. The path ahead of him grew darker, narrower, and far more dangerous, and every step he took would carry him closer to the tragedy that waited for him at its end. Thomas Seymour's troubles with Princess Elizabeth were only one strand of a far larger and darker web. His true target had always been King Edward VI, the young, impressionable boy who held the crown. As long as Edward lived, and as long as Edward's elder uncle, Edward Seymour, carried the title of Lord Protector, Thomas remained locked in fury. Day after day, as Somerset governed England, Thomas's jealousy swelled, tightening around him like a slow, suffocating coil. He watched his brother wield authority he craved, and the longing inside him grew into something desperate, something reckless, something that no longer cared for consequence. Thomas began his pursuit of power in the gentlest of disguises. He approached the young king with gifts, coins, trinkets, small comforts that made a child feel favoured and admired. He whispered soft compliments, told stories that flattered Edward's youth and stirred thoughts of independence. While the king listened with innocent ears, Thomas quietly planted seeds of doubt. He tried to persuade the boy that Somerset was taking too much power, that he, Edward, should distrust the uncle who led the kingdom in his name. It was a dangerous game, but Thomas believed he could bend the young king's loyalty without being seen. But Somerset noticed. He saw the late visits, the unusual influence, the smiles exchanged in corridors. He heard whispers of Thomas's attempts to undermine him. And so he ordered guards stationed outside Edward's bedchamber, silent watchers meant to protect the king not from foreign danger, but from the boy's own uncle. The moment that sealed Thomas's fate arrived one night when he attempted to enter the king's room after dark. The door was bolted, and as he pressed against it, a spaniel belonging to Edward awoke and began barking. Sharp, sudden, accusing. In a flash of anger or panic, Thomas drew his weapon and shot the dog. Its cry cut short in the stillness of the night. Then he fled, leaving behind the lifeless body of a creature that had served only to protect its young master. This single act tore away whatever mask Thomas still wore. The court now believed that he had come not to visit Edward, but to kidnap or even kill the child king. And the following morning, when Thomas was seen lingering near the royal apartments with a loaded pistol, the suspicion hardened into certainty. There was no excuse left, no gentle explanation that could soften the truth. He was seized, bound, and taken to the Tower of London. The investigation that followed uncovered more than anyone had expected. Testimonies revealed that Thomas had tried to stir rebellion within the navy. He had held secret conversations with pirates along the western coast, seeking their support. He had plotted to erode Somerset's authority, to weaken the council, and to place himself in control. He had even continued his ambition to marry Princess Elizabeth, believing that through her royal blood he could claim both legitimacy and dominance. Every action formed a thread in a noose he had woven with his own hands. The cruelest blow came not from the council, nor from the king, but from his own brother. Edward Seymour, the man who had risen higher, who had held the position Thomas coveted, who had commanded the kingdom during the boy's reign, was forced to sign the warrant for Thomas's arrest and execution. It was a bitter act. But if Somerset refused, he would risk being accused of protecting a traitor. His political standing, and perhaps even his life, depended on condemning the brother he had grown up beside. With the evidence laid bare, Thomas Seymour faced 33 charges of treason, a number so heavy that no plea, no argument, no last-minute confession could possibly overcome it. Each charge was a stone added to the weight of his downfall, and together they formed an unbreakable chain. The verdict was inevitable, and the sentence unalterable. By this point, fate had stepped forward quietly and placed its hand on Thomas's shoulder. His path, twisted with ambition, jealousy, and restless hunger, had reached its final turn. The fall he had set in motion now came rushing toward him, unstoppable, irreversible an end, shaped entirely by the darkness he had allowed to grow within his own heart. When Thomas Seymour was confined within the stone walls of the Tower of London, the court began gathering every fragment of evidence against him. Piece by piece, testimony by testimony, a picture emerged dark, undeniable, and damning. By the end of the investigation, the council charged him with 33 counts of treason, a list so long and so grave that it seemed to encompass every crime a Tudor nobleman could possibly commit. The principal accusations were stark and unrelenting: that he had attempted to break into the bedchamber of King Edward VI, that he had plotted to kidnap or murder the young king, that he had tried to incite the soldiers to rebel, that he had entered into secret dealings with pirates along the Western Sea, that he had acted against the authority of the Lord Protector Somerset, that he had sought to marry Princess Elizabeth to secure access to the throne, that he had married Catherine Parr with indecent haste for political advantage, that he had used gifts and flattery to manipulate King Edward VI. Even worse were the statements given by witnesses who claimed that Thomas had tried to teach the child king to take power into his own hands, a subtle but unmistakable attempt to turn Edward against his uncle Somerset. In a realm where stability depended on loyalty to the regency, this was not simply poor judgment. It was direct interference with the government itself, treason in its purest and most dangerous form. As the charges were read, the court reached a chilling conclusion. Thomas Seymour was a man whose ambition had no boundaries, no restraint. They believed he was willing to sacrifice dignity, loyalty, family, women, and even children if doing so brought him closer to power. His actions toward Elizabeth, though described in softer language in his own era, were later recognized for what they were: patterns of manipulation and exploitation, behaviors aimed at a vulnerable girl who had been placed under his protection. In the Tower, Thomas still clung to a small, desperate hope. He believed Elizabeth might speak for him, might write to the council, might show some sign of support. But Elizabeth remained silent. She offered no letters, no pleas, no defense. She withdrew completely, hiding her emotions with the same careful discipline she would one day use as queen. Her silence was not cruelty. It was survival. She knew that aligning herself with Thomas could destroy her future, and she understood that the court watched her every reaction. That silence marked a turning point. It showed that Elizabeth had already learned to navigate the poisonous world of Tudor politics. She did not condemn Thomas, but neither did she risk herself to save him. Her restraint, her caution, her refusal to be manipulated, these would become defining qualities of her long reign. But while Elizabeth's path rose upward, Thomas's path narrowed to a single, inescapable end. Somerset, his elder brother, faced the most painful decision of his life. He could protect Thomas, risking his own authority, his reputation, and possibly the stability of the kingdom. Or he could protect England by allowing justice to fall upon his own blood. To spare, Thomas would make Somerset look weak, corrupt, and unfit to rule. The council pressed him. The nobles whispered. The kingdom watched. In the end, Somerset bowed beneath the weight of duty and necessity. He signed the warrant for his brother's execution. What ended Thomas Seymour's life was not an enemy's sword, nor a rival's plot. It was the force of his own unrestrained ambition, an ambition that had devoured his judgment, his relationships, and ultimately his fate. The moment Somerset's ink touched the parchment, Thomas's future was sealed. The tower walls around him, cold and silent, became the final boundary of a man who had spent his life breaking boundaries that were never his to cross. His downfall was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty, written into the very consequences he had crafted with his own hands. On the 20th day of March in the year 1549, Thomas Seymour was led out onto Tower Hill, the final stage on the path he had carved with his own ambition. The morning air carried a hush that did not last long, for crowds gathered quickly, thick as a living wall around the scaffold. They pressed forward not with sorrow, but with a restless curiosity. They wanted to see how the man who once reached so boldly toward the throne would meet his end. Would he tremble with regret? Would he flash the arrogance that had followed him all his life? Or would he cling to a calm that no one believed he truly possessed? Records say that Thomas appeared strangely composed, his face smooth, his posture steady. But beneath that outward stillness lay a storm only he could feel. Just 2 years earlier, he had been one of the most influential men in England. Uncle to a king, brother to the Lord Protector, commander, diplomat, and husband of a queen. Now he stood on his knees before the block, waiting for the executioner's axe. His rise had been rapid, glittering, almost blinding. His fall had come even faster. The murmurs of the crowd rose like distant waves. Some whispered that he deserved this. Some wondered if he felt remorse. Others simply watched, transfixed by the spectacle that Tudor England so often offered. When the executioner raised his axe, an uneasy silence washed over the hill. The blade paused for a breath, held aloft in the pale light, and then fell with a final, irrevocable motion. With that single swing, the life of Thomas Seymour ended the life of a man shaped by envy, sharpened by hunger, and consumed by his own ambition. But the consequences of his actions did not die with him. They drifted outward, lingering long after his body was carried away. Princess Elizabeth carried the scar of his behavior for the rest of her life. His actions toward Elizabeth, though described in softer language in his own era, were later recognized for what they were: patterns of manipulation and exploitation, behaviors aimed at a vulnerable girl who had been placed under his protection. In the Tower, Thomas still clung to a small, desperate hope. He believed Elizabeth might speak for him, might write to the council, might show some sign of support. But Elizabeth remained silent. She offered no letters, no pleas, no defence. For Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, the consequences were equally heavy. Signing the death warrant of his own brother fractured his reputation. The nobles whispered that he had failed to control his family. Others accused him of cruelty. The image of fraternal betrayal clung to him, weakening the authority he tried so desperately to maintain. And in the years that followed, the political storm eventually turned on him as well. He too was arrested, condemned, and executed. He too died on Tower Hill. 2 brothers, once powerful, once close to the heart of the kingdom, both destroyed by ambition, both executed at the same place, both offering a grim lesson about the dangers of reaching too far, too fiercely. In the Tudor world, the court itself suffered. Thomas's schemes deepened rifts already forming within the Regency Council. Distrust spread, loyalties shifted, factions hardened. The pursuit of power so intoxicating to Thomas left scars across the political landscape. It showed how quickly a single man's desire could unsettle an entire realm. To the people of England, Thomas Seymour became a symbol of 3 things: betrayal, misuse of power, and envy. He had been given everything a man of his time could wish for: status, respect, opportunity, military command, royal favour, and a place within the innermost circle of monarchy. But he wanted more, much more. He wanted influence over a king, marriage to a princess, control over the kingdom. He wanted, in quiet corners of his mind, the crown itself. And the crown had no mercy for men who reached for it without right. After his death, the whispers faded into a sober truth. Thomas Seymour's legacy was not a list of victories, nor acts of service, nor diplomatic triumphs. It was a shadow, one of the darkest chapters in English history. A chapter where ambition twisted into obsession, where affection became manipulation, where guardianship turned into exploitation. A chapter where a man's hunger devoured everything around him, until at last it devoured him too. And so his story ends not with glory, but with silence. A silence that settled over Tower Hill the moment the axe fell, and has lingered ever since, as a quiet reminder of how ambition, unchecked and unsheltered, can destroy even the brightest, most promising path a man might walk. The death of Thomas Seymour was not only the end of a single ambitious man, it was the moment a deep shadow fell over the entire Seymour family. For years, the family had risen steadily, carried upward by the quiet dignity of Jane Seymour, the 3rd wife of Henry VIII and the mother of Edward VI. Through her, the Seymours had touched the height of royal favour. But after Thomas's scandals, that height became a steep and dangerous cliff. One by one, their footholds slipped, and the family's reputation began to crumble. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector of England, already lived beneath the wary eyes of the court. His power was immense, too immense for the comfort of many nobles. They whispered that he ruled with a heavy hand, that he held too much authority over the young king, that no single man should stand so tall above the rest. And then came the terrible moment when he was forced to sign the execution warrant for his own brother. The ink that dried on that parchment stained not only Thomas's fate but Somerset's reputation as well. The council saw weakness where Somerset felt only sorrow. They murmured that he had acted too slowly, that he had allowed Thomas to run wild for too long, that he had failed to control his own family. Instead of strengthening his position, Thomas's downfall weakened him. Support slipped away. Loyalty thinned. The nobles looked at Somerset not as a capable protector, but as a man divided by blood, a man unable to govern his household, let alone a kingdom. And the Seymour name, once bright, once honoured, became a symbol of discord. Thomas was remembered as a traitor, reckless and hungry for power. Somerset was remembered as a leader who lacked the resolve to prevent disaster. The brothers became two sides of a single tragedy, one burning with ambition, the other smothered by responsibility. Even after Thomas's execution, the chaos he left behind continued to ripple through the court. The plots he had nurtured, the whispers he had started, and the dangers he had stirred forced the council to create new rules, new precautions, new defences to protect the young King Edward VI from any further threats. What made the situation even more cruel was the way Thomas's betrayal became the perfect weapon for Somerset's enemies. They accused him of failing as a patriarch and failing as a protector of the realm. If he cannot rule his own blood, they said, how can he rule England? It was a slow, tightening snare, one that Somerset noticed too late. Isolation closed in around him, and the allies he once trusted began to drift away. A few years after Thomas was beheaded on Tower Hill, Somerset found himself walking the same dreadful path. He too was arrested. He too was taken to the Tower of London, and he too met his death beneath the executioner's axe. Two brothers, elevated by fortune, undone by ambition, both lost to the same cold stone and steel. Their fall became a lesson etched into the history of Tudor England. Power in this age was never a gift, never a treasure to hold lightly. It was a blade sharp enough to reshape families, kingdoms, and futures, but equally sharp enough to cut down those who dared hold it without caution. One misstep, one uncontrolled desire, one reckless choice could destroy not only a man but everyone tied to him. And at the heart of that destruction stood Thomas Seymour. His hunger for influence, his reckless pursuit of authority, his willingness to manipulate, betray, and endanger these were the sparks that ignited the ruin of an entire lineage. The Seymour legacy, once adorned with royal connection and noble promise, became overshadowed by the darkness he unleashed. In the end, Thomas did not simply fall. He pulled his family down with him, leaving behind not triumph, not honour, but one of the bleakest chapters in English history. A chapter shaped by ambition that burned too fiercely, consuming everything in its path. Thomas Seymour's actions did not simply spark scandal in his own lifetime. They carved wounds into the inner world of Princess Elizabeth, wounds that would shape the future queen for the rest of her life. In the Tudor era, there were no proper words for concepts like child grooming or the abuse of a minor. The language of that age wrapped such matters in vague phrases or nervous silences. But the absence of vocabulary did not lessen the reality. What Thomas did to Elizabeth contained every element we recognize today as manipulation, violation of boundaries, and exploitation of youth. Elizabeth endured mornings when Thomas burst into her chamber unannounced. She endured the humiliation of having her gown cut apart in public, the panic of being held still so that she could not escape, the unsettling sensation of his hands where they did not belong, the forced teasing masked as harmless play. To any 14-year-old girl, these moments would have been confusing, frightening, and deeply scarring. But for Elizabeth, who lived her life in the bright but dangerous spotlight of royalty, the trauma was doubled. She suffered in private, and then she suffered again in public when the rumours spread. When whispers began claiming she was pregnant with Thomas's child, when people said she had been taken to the Tower or promised in marriage, the emotional toll grew even heavier. What had happened to her in the quiet rooms of Chelsea Manor transformed into weapons of gossip, threatening her honour, her future, and even her life. Elizabeth was forced not only to navigate her own pain, but also to defend herself from accusations she had never invited. In this way, the personal and political fused, leaving a mark far deeper than anyone at the time could see. Many historians believe these experiences forged in Elizabeth a lifelong vigilance, an instinctive wariness toward men, power, and intimacy itself. She learned, painfully and young, that closeness could be turned into exploitation. Affection could become a political weapon. Marriage could be the most dangerous trap of all. These lessons sank into her like quiet truths, eventually forming the foundation of the most defining decision of her reign. She would not marry. Becoming the Virgin Queen was not merely a political strategy, it was a shield. By refusing to wed, Elizabeth removed herself from the marriage alliances that had destroyed so many Tudor women before her. She denied foreign princes the chance to control her. She denied English nobles any hope of manipulating her through a husband. And, perhaps most importantly, she denied any man the power to wound her the way Thomas once had. But the trauma did not make Elizabeth fragile. It made her sharper, stronger, more perceptive. After the darkness of Chelsea Manor, she learned to speak with precision, to guard her words as carefully as her crown. She mastered silence, when to use it, when to let it protect her. She refused to reveal emotions that could be exploited. She became disciplined in the art of controlling her public image, knowing that the slightest misstep could summon another round of whispers. These skills became the armor she carried into every storm that followed. The Wyatt Rebellion, the dangerous years under her sister Mary I, the betrayals, plots, and fractures that shaped Tudor politics. By the time she ascended the throne, Elizabeth had already faced trials that would have broken others. Her childhood, though marked by fear and confusion, became her first lesson in survival. In time, this survival grew into mastery. Becoming the Virgin Queen was not merely a political strategy, it was a shield. By refusing to wed, Elizabeth removed herself from the marriage alliances that had destroyed so many Tudor women before her. She denied foreign princes the chance to control her. She denied English nobles any hope of manipulating her through a husband. And, perhaps most importantly, she denied any man the power to wound her the way Thomas once had. But the trauma did not make Elizabeth fragile. He taught her how to stand alone. Thomas Seymour left behind no glory, no triumph, no honourable legacy. But in the shadows of his wrongdoing, Elizabeth's character was tempered like a blade. And it was that hardened, unbreakable resolve that shaped a queen whose name would echo through centuries long after Thomas Seymour's own legacy had faded into darkness. In this story, Catherine Parr emerges as the most tragic figure of all, gentle, educated, compassionate, yet undone, not by enemies or politics, but by the very love she chose to trust. She was the sixth and final wife of King Henry VIII, a woman of remarkable intellect, deep piety, and a calm, steady kindness rare in the Tudor world. And yet her devotion to Thomas Seymour led her into choices that history would judge as both heartbreaking and disastrously misplaced. Long before she married the aging king, Catherine had cared for Thomas. Their early affection had been genuine, warm, and rooted in a tenderness she did not often express. When Henry died in the January of the year 1547, Catherine turned instinctively back to Thomas, partly from lingering love, partly because Thomas knew exactly how to draw her in. Only 4 months later, by the May of that same year, the pair married in secret. It was a union forged quickly, too quickly, and it set the country whispering with shock and disapproval. People said the king was not yet cold, that Catherine had disgraced herself, that the Queen Dowager had acted with indecent haste. But the deeper tragedy lay not in the scandal, but in Catherine's blindness to the danger Thomas brought into her home. When Thomas began behaving inappropriately toward Princess Elizabeth, the girl Catherine loved and had treated as a daughter, Catherine brushed it aside as harmless play, a foolish jest, a bit of mischief. She did not yet see that the man she cherished had no boundaries, no restraint, and no understanding of the emotional harm he caused. In her desire to keep peace, to please the husband she had finally been allowed to choose for herself, she ignored signs that would later haunt her memory. As the spring of 1548 arrived and Catherine became pregnant, her strength began to fade. Pregnancy taxed her body, clouded her mind with exhaustion and worry. She could no longer confront Thomas's behavior with the firmness it demanded. Then, slowly, painfully, she began to notice a pattern. Elizabeth was not the only young girl who drew Thomas's attention. Lady Jane Grey and other maidens who crossed his path all seemed to become objects of his bold, inappropriate charm. It was then that Catherine felt the truth dawn over her, cold and terrible. Thomas had always been dangerous, and the danger had been inside her house. But the realization came too late. In the September of 1548, soon after giving birth to her daughter Mary Seymour, Catherine Parr died of childbed fever. She left behind a newborn child, a fractured household, and a husband who mourned her far less than she deserved. For scarcely had Catherine's body been laid to rest before Thomas turned again toward Elizabeth, pursuing her with a determination that stripped away any illusion that his affection for Catherine had ever been pure. To many historians, this was the final proof that Thomas had used Catherine as a bridge, a stepping stone toward greater power. Yet Catherine had not been a foolish woman. She had been one of the most educated queens England had ever seen, a writer, a patron of learning, a guiding force in Elizabeth's early education. She had been kind, thoughtful, and sensitive. But intelligence was no shield against the vulnerabilities of love. Catherine loved Thomas with a softness that left her unguarded, and in that vulnerability she made choices that allowed harm to grow unchecked. It was a union forged quickly, too quickly, and it set the country whispering with shock and disapproval. People said the king was not yet cold, that Catherine had disgraced herself, that the Queen Dowager had acted with indecent haste. But the deeper tragedy lay not in the scandal, but in Catherine's blindness to the danger Thomas brought into her home. Her life and her sorrow echo quietly beneath the louder dramas of Tudor history, reminding us that courage and intellect cannot always protect a heart that loves too deeply. In the midst of this tangled and unsettling story, King Edward VI, only 9 years old when he inherited the throne, became the most fragile figure caught in a web he could neither see nor understand. He was a child placed at the centre of the deadliest political game in England, a game whose rules were written by adults hungry for power, and whose consequences would shape the course of his short and troubled life. Edward was bright, well-educated, and naturally observant. He understood theology, languages, and kingship far more than most boys his age. But intelligence could not protect him from manipulation. He lived in a world where affection could hide ambition, where kindness could conceal schemes, and where even family could become a threat. When Thomas Seymour approached him with gifts, coins, charming trinkets, promises whispered with warmth, Edward was captivated. Seymour spoke to him not as a child, but as a prince, telling him that he should hold his own power, hinting that Somerset, the Lord Protector, was keeping him too tightly controlled. For a boy raised to believe he was chosen by God to rule, those words landed deeply. Edward did not grasp that he was becoming a pawn in Seymour's plot to seize the crown's authority for himself. What Seymour disguised as encouragement was, in truth, the planting of doubt. Doubt designed to turn nephew against uncle, king against protector. If we look at Edward's own writings, the detachment is chilling. In his journal, he recorded Seymour's arrest and execution with short, emotionless lines, as if noting the weather or the outcome of a lesson. Such coldness suggests not understanding, but confusion. A child unable to comprehend why the uncle who had been affectionate one moment was condemned the next. The night Seymour tried to break into Edward's bedchamber marked a turning point. When Seymour shot the spaniel that guarded the king, a loyal dog Edward adored, it left a wound deeper than the court ever acknowledged. To a 9-year-old child, that dog was not simply an animal. It was comfort, companionship, protection. For Seymour to kill it so ruthlessly, in the darkness outside his door, was a moment likely to leave a lasting shadow. Many historians believe the incident lodged itself in Edward's memory, shaping his sense of danger and distrust. But the shock did not end there. Seymour's execution in the year 1549 was only the beginning of the turmoil that surrounded Edward's youth. Soon after, his other uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, fell from power, arrested, condemned, and executed on Tower Hill just as Thomas had been. In the span of only a few years, Edward watched both maternal uncles die by the axe, both accused of treason, both disgraced before the kingdom. The Seymour name, once the symbol of the family that had given England a male heir, became associated with ambition, betrayal, and internal destruction. And Edward, quiet and observant, absorbed it all. He grew up in a world where adults threatened each other for influence, where power shifted violently, and where loyalty was a fragile illusion. The walls of the royal household were filled with tension, with whispers behind closed doors, with sudden arrests and quiet executions. It was a place where titles meant nothing when fear took hold. And in that environment, Edward learned to see the world not through trust, but through caution. By the time the young king began to take a more active role in government, those early lessons had hardened him. He became stricter, more rigid in belief, and at times surprisingly cold. The bright, thoughtful child grew into a ruler shaped by instability, one who understood the dangers of dissent and the fragility of order, because he had seen his own family torn apart by ambition. Edward VI's story reveals a tragic truth about Tudor politics, that the hunger for power did not harm only the schemers and plotters. It wounded the children who lived among them. It left emotional scars no one recorded, shaping lives in ways history could only infer. The intrigue that destroyed Thomas Seymour, that crushed Somerset, also carved itself quietly into the heart of a boy king who had never wished to rule so soon, and who would not live long enough to escape the shadows cast over his childhood. In the final arc of this story, Thomas Seymour stands revealed as one of the clearest villains of the Tudor age, a man whose path was not shaped by ideology, nor by injustice, nor by political conviction, but by pure, unfiltered, personal ambition. Unlike rebels who rose in the name of reform, or those who fought out of desperation, Thomas pursued power for its own sake. He wanted influence not to steer England toward a vision, but simply to possess authority, to rise above everyone around him, and to bend the kingdom to his will. His legacy can be understood through three haunting dimensions, each one a shadow that stretched far beyond his death. First, the abuse of personal power. Thomas's behavior toward Princess Elizabeth remains the most disturbing and unforgivable chapter of his life. What he inflicted upon the 14-year-old princess was not merely scandal, it was a profound violation of trust, dignity, and safety. The mornings he intruded into her chamber, the humiliating scene in which he cut her gown into pieces, the unwanted physical contact, the teasing disguised as affection, all of it left scars that followed Elizabeth into adulthood. For the woman who would later become Queen Elizabeth I, these memories formed a quiet ache beneath her strength, shaping her wariness, her emotional caution, and her refusal ever to marry. Through his actions, Thomas altered not only Elizabeth's childhood, but the entire future of the English monarchy. Second, betrayal on every front. Thomas Seymour betrayed everyone who placed trust in him. He betrayed the young king he was supposed to protect, turning his influence into a weapon, whispering doubts into his mind, and eventually attempting to breach the royal bedchamber at night. He betrayed the crown by conspiring against the Regency Council, aligning with sailors and even pirates in the West. He betrayed his own brother, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, undermining him while pretending loyalty. And he betrayed Catherine Parr, the woman who had loved him with rare sincerity. Catherine defended him, trusted him, and ignored her own instincts for his sake, only to discover his intentions had been rooted not in love, but in advantage. Third, blind, devouring ambition. Thomas's hunger for power grew wild and uncontrollable. He married Catherine Parr a mere 4 months after the death of Henry VIII. He tried to marry Princess Elizabeth after Catherine died. He showered Edward VI with gifts, hoping to manipulate the boy. He shot the king's dog and attempted to enter the king's chamber actions that exposed the terrifying lengths he was willing to go. Each step he took moved him closer to treason, until the 33 charges against him, 33 counts of treason, became the final measure of how far he had fallen. His execution did not erase his presence from history. Instead, it transformed him into a symbol, a warning of how a man's unchecked desires can warp his conscience, corrode his loyalty, and poison every life around him. The collapse of the Seymour family, the emotional wounds borne by Elizabeth, the heartbreak of Catherine Parr, the shaken trust of young Edward VI, all of it can be traced back to Thomas's relentless pursuit of power. He was a storm contained within one man, and wherever he went, he left ruin behind him. The Tudor period was filled with dangerous figures, schemers, plotters, ruthless statesmen. But Thomas Seymour stands apart because the threat he posed did not arise from brilliance or strategic genius. It arose from desire, impulse, and bottomless ambition. These traits, uncontrolled and unchecked, made him unpredictable, reckless, and profoundly destructive. And so he remains one of the most unsettling villains of the Tudor era. Not the cleverest, not the most powerful, but perhaps the most dangerously driven.